The National Desk, America's News Now.
Developing now, inflation surprise. The Federal Reserve issuing a new warning after a key measure shows prices rising faster than expected.
I think the real issue is we need to do more.
From the grocery store to the gas pump, just how much more you're shelling out for everyday items and when we can expect to see some relief.
The kind of inflation we have rarely returns to normal levels.
Plus, a war of words. Russia responding to President Biden's new nuclear message to Vladimir Putin.
He, in fact, cannot continue with impunity to talk about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon.
How a nuclear strike would change the course of conflict in Ukraine and the role the U.S. military might have to play.
No one can be sure what would happen, and it could end in Armageddon.
And with just weeks to go until midterm elections, several races heating up. The key issues firing up voters.
We're out here struggling to make ends meet.
And the blows being exchanged on the debate stage.
When you have guys like J.D. Vance who can't stand up to anybody.
He wants to kill and confront, what is it, the MAGA movement, Tim?
Where the latest polls stand in some of the most closely watched races.
This is the National Desk, America's News Now. I'm Eugene Ramirez, and on this weekend edition, we're taking a look at the big headlines of the week and a look ahead at what to expect. We're following 4 big stories for you this week. A key inflation report showing rising prices are sticking around, prompting more recession fears. Nuclear concerns growing as President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin issue new warnings. Alex Jones ordered to pay nearly $1 billion in damages to some of the families of the Sandy Hook massacre, and the FDA authorizing new COVID booster shots for children as officials warn we could soon see a surge in cases. We start with a deeper look at the new numbers this week showing Americans still getting pummeled by those high prices despite historic rate hikes by the Federal Reserve to keep inflation in check. New estimates from personal finance company NerdWallet show that due to inflation, the average household would have to spend an extra $11,500 this year just to keep up with the same standard of living as previous years. The National Desk Audra El-Nashar breaks down where prices are rising the fastest and what it means for the chances of a recession.
September's consumer inflation report coming in hotter than expected, delivering another blow to the economy, revealing Americans paid 8.2% more for everyday needs than they did last year. Clothing up 5.5%, rent up 7.2%. But much of inflation is driven by food prices. Overall grocery costs up 13%. Bread up almost 15%, dairy products up almost 16%, and eggs up more than 30%. Shoppers trying to keep up.
So basically, just navigate through the sale items. Yeah, that's what you got to do.
In September, Americans got a bit of a break at the gas pump, but prices have bounced back since then. Other energy prices already driving up utility bills before winter's even hit.
Now we are going to have to choose up here in the Northeast. Do we want food, medications, or heating oil?
The vast majority of Americans, 82%, say inflation is an extremely or very important issue, according to a recent Monmouth poll, and only 30% approve of how President Biden's handled it. Earlier this week, the president downplayed the possibility of a recession under growing political pressure less than 4 weeks from Election Day.
I don't think there will be a recession. If it is, it'll be a very slight recession. That is, we'll move down slightly.
The inflation report may have increased the chances of a recession. It gave the Fed no reason to back off of its restrictive monetary policies, like raising interest rates. That adds to the risk that they'll go too far and push the economy into recession. Some relief coming to about 70 million Americans on Social Security. The average monthly payment will go up more than $140 next year. A lifeline for many, as there's no real sign yet of an end to soaring prices. In Washington, I'm Audra El-Nashar for the National Desk, America's News Now.
This week, Federal Reserve officials are warning the central bank has yet to make a dent on inflation. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland says officials need to keep raising interest rates and cannot get complacent now. Next month, the Fed is expected to deliver its 4th consecutive 0.75% rate hike. The chief economic advisor at the financial services firm Allianz says the U.S. is facing a recession because the Federal Reserve has made 2 big mistakes. The first was characterizing inflation as temporary. The second was not easing easing off the gas sooner. All of that leading to a possible third mistake, as he explained to CBS News.
And as a result, we risk mistake number 3, which is by not easing their foot off the accelerator last year, they are slamming on the brakes this year, which would tip us into recession. I fear that we risk a very high probability of a damaging recession that was totally avoidable.
Now, other economists point to different problems, namely the fact that the Fed is trying to slow demand through interest rate hikes while severe supply chain issues remain. And when it comes to the housing market, would-be homebuyers right now being hit with a double whammy. Not only are interest rates now over 7%, but it's getting harder to qualify for those mortgage loans, too. Mortgage credit availability is the lowest it's been in over 9 years. Lenders right now concerned a weaker economy will lead to a rise in mortgage delinquencies. Meantime, the threat of a railroad strike back now. The third largest rail union in the country rejected a tentative agreement Monday with freight carriers. The Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters says the railroads did not do enough to address concerns over paid time off and demanding working conditions. Now, without a new deal, there could be a strike, but the union says that would not happen before November 19th. The Biden administration warning again this week about a growing nuclear threat from Russia. In comments to CNN, President Biden calling Vladimir Putin's recent threats irresponsible.
I think it's irresponsible for him to talk about it. The idea that a world leader of one of the largest nuclear powers in the world says he may use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine.
The Kremlin firing back, calling that interview both harmful and provocative. This week, NATO countries met in Brussels to discuss Ukraine's defense, and one senior official says the use of nuclear weapons would trigger a, quote, physical response from NATO members, causing unprecedented consequences for Russia. The White House unveiling its new national security strategy this week. Now, this plan includes working to, quote, outcompete China, also constrain Russia, and to invest in and strengthen the military and the U.S. nuclear arsenal. That strategy document, however, was delayed because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it comes at a time Russian President Vladimir Putin has been escalating violence. The National Desk's Christine Frizzell reports.
In the drive to make gains in this brutal war, this week has been marked by devastating losses. Russian President Vladimir Putin calling the explosion on the Kerch Bridge connecting Russia to Crimea a terrorist attack. Responding with missile attacks in Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, and in residential neighborhoods in Zaporizhia.
It's brutal. It's beyond the pale.
Around the world, fears are expanding that the Russian president, seen as growing more desperate, will result to using nuclear weapons. While U.S. officials say they don't believe he's reached that point now, President Biden Tuesday defended recent comments he made, comparing the gravity of the situation to the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago in an interview with CNN.
He, in fact, cannot continue with impunity to talk about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon as if that's a rational thing to do. The mistakes get made, and the miscalculation could occur. No one can be sure what would happen, and it could end in Armageddon.
That assessment criticized by some in Washington, who argue it makes the United States seem fearful.
When Iran and China and Russia and North Korea see a weak and scared president, it makes them more aggressive. It makes Putin invade Ukraine. It makes China think about invading Taiwan.
But for those on the ground, the fears are part of daily life now. Western leaders promising new weapons and resources to help Ukraine while trying to assess what the Russian president will plan to do next. For its part, NATO says it's planning to carry out its annual nuclear deterrence drills next week, which leaders say will showcase its, quote, firm, predictable behavior and military strength. I'm Christine Frizzell, reporting for the National Desk, America's News Now.
Right now, the United States is reevaluating its relationship with Saudi Arabia. This comes after OPEC Plus announced last week that it would cut oil production by 2 million barrels per day. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. officials warned Saudi leaders that a cut would be viewed as a clear choice to side with Russia in the war. Well, Saudi officials dismissed the request, prompting the review of the United States relationship with the country. A big verdict in the defamation case against conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. A Connecticut jury awarded nearly $1 billion to Sandy Hook families and a first responder. The 15 plaintiffs will get $965 million from Jones and his company. They sued for defamation over his false claims that the 2012 school shooting was a hoax.
I shouldn't have to worry about what my daughters are going to go through when I tell them that it's best that they just tell the truth, because that's all we did. Every day in that courtroom, we got up on the stand and we told the truth.
Jones was on air broadcasting live as that verdict was read, making an urgent plea to his followers for cash. Now, he claims he is shielded from making that massive payout because he's in bankruptcy, and he told his audience that any money that they donate will go to stabilizing his company and appealing the verdict. Families of the victims killed in the Parkland school shooting outraged after a jury recommended the gunman not be executed for that high school massacre. The jury instead recommended that Nicholas Cruz be sentenced to life in prison without parole. Cruz, you'll remember, shot and killed 14 students and 3 staff members at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. That was on Valentine's Day 2018. Straight ahead, renters feeling the squeeze as rents rise. The main factor driving up rent nationwide and whether pre-pandemic prices will return. Then school board meetings without security. Why a sheriff says he had to pull his deputies. We'll be right back. The National Desk team of reporters bringing you the headlines from coast to coast. From a Virginia sheriff's message to a demanding school board to high rent in Florida. We're taking the pulse of America, and we start with Ohio volunteers returning home after helping hurricane victims.
84 Ohio Task Force 1 members pile off charter buses. Their 2-week mission to southwestern Florida is complete.
It's going to be a long process, as we know, for them, and it always is.
The widespread havoc Hurricane Ian wreaked is still being cleaned up. A thought that's tough for the team.
It's comforting for us to get back home, but at the same time, you know, we're going to be thinking about those people down there that have to recover from this for a long time.
The group conducted over 4,500 house-by-house searches with some extra help.
We did utilize the dogs quite a bit, searching where the refiles were and where houses used to be.
Ohio Task Force 1 rescued dozens of people. While the team gets a break for now, it's not if, but rather a matter of when the next disaster strikes.
We charge our batteries, we prepare for the next inevitable disaster that occurs, and we pray that it doesn't happen.
To me, that's a total disgrace that we're even dealing with this.
Spotsylvania County Sheriff Roger Harris not mincing words about his decision to no longer have deputies provide security at school board meetings after repeated scenes like this.
Officers,
in
front of this board. Disruptor from the room.
Ultimately, the sheriff feels school board chairman Kirk Twigg is to blame.
If I had to point the finger, I would point it at one person.
And that is Mr. Twigg.
I don't use Mr. when I'm talking about Twigg. When they're telling my deputies, eject people from the meeting and they have the right to be there and they have a right to free speech, it's putting the deputies in a very bad spot. And it put the citizens actually in a bad spot.
Harris sent school board members a letter last month notifying them his deputies are done, effective October 14th.
All in all, it was the way people were treated.
The National Desk team of reporters bringing you the headlines from coast to coast. From a Virginia sheriff's message to a demanding school board to high rent in Florida. We're taking the pulse of America. We start in Ohio with volunteers there returning home after helping hurricane victims.
84 Ohio Task Force 1 members pile off charter buses. Their 2-week mission to southwestern Florida is complete.
It's going to be a long process, as we know, for them, and it always is.
The widespread havoc Hurricane Ian wreaked is still being cleaned up. A thought that's tough for the team.
It's comforting for us to get back home, but at the same time, you know, we're going to be thinking about those people down there that have to recover from this for a long time.
The group conducted over 4,500 house-by-house searches with some extra help.
We did utilize the dogs quite a bit, searching where the refiles were and where houses used to be.
Ohio Task Force 1 rescued dozens of people. While the team gets a break for now, it's not if, but rather a matter of when the next disaster strikes.
We charge our batteries, we prepare for the next inevitable disaster that occurs, and we pray that it doesn't happen.
To me, that's a total disgrace that we're even dealing with this.
Spotsylvania County Sheriff Roger Harris not mincing words about his decision to no longer have deputies provide security at school board meetings after repeated scenes like this.
Officers, in front of this board. Disruptor from the room.
Ultimately, the sheriff feels school board chairman Kirk Twigg is to blame.
If I had to point the finger, I would point it at one person.
And that is Mr. Twig.
I don't use Mr. when I'm talking about Twig. When they're telling my deputies eject people from the meeting and they have the right to be there and they have a right to free speech, it's putting the deputies in a very bad spot. And it put the citizens actually in a bad spot.
Harris sent school board members a letter last month notifying them his deputies are done, effective October 14th.
All in all, it was the way people were treated.
The rent cycles, I've never seen them be this volatile in 40 years.
If you rent a home or an apartment, you know it's getting expensive. The past couple of years is unprecedented.
Florida stands out more than most other states because of the massive number of people that have been moving in, and we've been slow to build here too.
Prior to COVID, the average rent was actually pretty low. After the pandemic eviction moratorium expired, rent went through the roof. Right now, South Florida residents are paying 22% more than they did last year. Over the last 6 months, rent only went up 6.8%. So the pace of increase is slowing, but supply is still an issue.
We're way behind in construction.
Other factors putting pressure on the market include mortgage costs. With interest rate around 7%, fewer people can afford to buy.
As we build more, rents will stabilize, incomes will come up. They're not going back to 2019, 2020, 2021 prices. That's just not going to happen.
As Americans continue to see soaring prices these days, experts say likely inflation adjustments from the IRS could save you some tax dollars. But if you get a raise to offset inflation, it could actually mean that you'll pay more in taxes. I'm back with our fact check team now looking into these adjustments. Connor, how will we see higher taxes?
Yeah, we could see those higher taxes, and this is a reason why. Something that's often overlooked is what happens to state tax burdens when inflation is high. Because if a state doesn't adjust its tax brackets, deductions, or exemptions as well, it can lead to something called bracket creep.
Okay, and what exactly is a bracket creep?
So bracket creep happens when inflation pushes taxpayers into higher income brackets or reduces the value of credit and deductions. In other words, it increases income taxes without an increase in real income.
Okay, now that's precisely why we have these inflation adjustments at the federal level, but some states, you all found out, they don't adjust the bracket for those who are seeing higher wages. Why is that, and what states are those?
Right, so while most states with a progressive income tax system do adjust to prevent bracket creep, we found that there are 13 states that don't index any relevant major components. We have that list for you. Take a look at your screens. You'll see it includes states like New York, New Jersey, Virginia, Connecticut, and Delaware.
Now, are any of these states trying to do anything about this?
So out of those 13 states, only New Jersey and Connecticut have legislation in the works. But we did find that in New York, eligible retirees may see a cost of living adjustment increase in their monthly pension payments. And West Virginia is looking to get rid of its personal income tax altogether. And there's good news for taxpayers in Mississippi and Georgia because the bracket creep will soon be a non-issue thanks to recent legislation by Governors Tate Reeves and Brian Kemp that will move their state incomes to a flat income tax.
Okay, good to know. Thank you both. And the Fact Check team will continue to follow developments on these and other issues. You can also read this story with the links to where they found their information on our website, thenationaldesk.com. The White House warns another COVID surge is expected this winter. Coming up, Dr. Erica chimes in on the new recommendations to stop the spread. You're watching The National Desk, America's News Now. The Biden administration is urging Americans to get their flu and updated COVID-19 booster shots soon. White House COVID-19 response coordinator Dr. Ashish Jha warns the winter season is expected to be challenging. He says people should get their vaccinations before Halloween. That's because it takes a couple of weeks for the immune system to generate the benefit of that shot. Dr. Jha says getting it now means Americans will be protected going into the holidays.
So there's no time period where the window is out and you're no longer going to benefit. You will always benefit. But the bottom line is, if you do it before Thanksgiving, you're going to see family and friends. Before the holidays, a lot of socializing that goes on in December. It's going to be a really good time to get it done before Halloween.
Now, Dr. Jha adds it's critical everyone eligible get the updated COVID-19 vaccine. It's designated to target both the original versions of COVID as well as the BA.5 variant that's circulating now. He says getting both vaccines could save hundreds of lives each day this winter season. Well, late this week, both the CDC and the FDA expanded emergency use authorization of the new COVID boosters to include children as young as 5 years old for the Pfizer vaccine and 6 for the Moderna one. Now, I spoke with Dr. Erica Aragono for her medical opinion on boosters, as many parents right now may believe their children are in the clear as more time passes by.
I think it's a great question for the sense that parents often come to my office and ask the same thing about influenza or other communicable illnesses, right? Their children made it this far, maybe they're immune. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. As we see these viruses mutate and change, that's where we're trying to keep up to date and current on the vaccines to catch up with the mutational strains. So even though your child may not have been affected so far with COVID, and that is a wonderful thing, we still need to protect them for the future with these updated vaccinations.
Let's say a parent has a change of heart now, wants to go ahead and vaccinate their child. Would that child get just the latest version, or do they need to do some catch up here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So monovalent basically is that original COVID vaccine that we saw come out. You would still start with that vaccination series for the first and second vaccine, no matter where your child was in the series. We don't start with the bivalent. That's predominantly because this new vaccine hasn't been studied to show its effectiveness against the start of COVID. So starting with that vaccination as much as that wonderful protection that the original vaccine has provided. However, that extra booster now has been really targeting that Omicron variant that we've seen. That's the majority of cases that we're now seeing with people being ill from. So the important thing is to protect against both.
That makes sense. Let's talk about adults here. They're also putting off the booster shots. In fact, only 4% of eligible Americans have gotten the latest boosters that became available back around Labor Day. Recently, the president got plenty of backlash saying that the pandemic is over. With many Americans wanting to move on and hearing messages like that, should there be concern from a medical standpoint, and if so, why?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'm a physician. This is what I see day in, day out. But a lot of people who aren't in healthcare don't really see an active virus or an active problem. You know, we've heard about the pandemic for several years now, and unfortunately, we're kind of becoming nonchalant about it. What doctors are trying to do is stress the importance that the virus is still out there. And as it continues to mutate, we're still seeing people get really sick. I mean, we're still seeing about 400 deaths per day from COVID in the United States alone. And that's a lot. So really what we want to do is stress the importance of vaccination and early vaccination and still prevention. I mean, you've heard of cold and cough season. We know we're going into the cold and flu season, right? What better way to protect yourself than getting a vaccination that has been proven to significantly decrease the risk of hospitalizations and of deaths? So while it might not seem as scary as March 2020, COVID, unfortunately, is still here, and we have to take the best defense.
Okay, and a real quick question and practical question for you here before we let you go. Flu shot and the booster, do you get them together, or is that a no-no?
You absolutely can get both of them together as long as you don't have any contraindications to either vaccine. We often will administer it the same day, both shots to a patient. Just make sure you check with your doctor because everyone is different, but it's absolutely safe to get both. And we are recommending both right now as we go into that flu season as well.
Okay, Dr. Erica, thanks so much as always, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Eugene.
Food products regulated by the FDA must now meet certain criteria to be labeled healthy. Now, this follows a new rule proposed by the agency late last month. Many popular cereals, including ones you may think are healthy, now can't be called such. Among them, Honey Nut Cheerios, Raisin Bran, Corn Flakes, Life, and Special K. Those can no longer market themselves as healthy. For that healthy stamp, cereals must contain 3/4 ounces of whole grains, no more than 1 gram of saturated fat, less than 230 milligrams of sodium, and 2.5 grams of added sugars. Returning to the classroom after Hurricane Ian. Ahead, when some Southwest Florida schools hope to welcome back students. We're back after this. Taking a look at the top trending stories on our website now. Charges against Adnan Syed were dropped by Baltimore prosecutors after new DNA evidence proved his innocence. Last month, Syed's murder conviction was tossed and he was freed after nearly 20 years in prison. An American couple on their honeymoon in Spain hailed as heroes for saving babies from a burning nursery. The pair say instinct took over when they saw flames. They took at least a dozen babies to safety. Netflix rolling out its first version of its streaming service with ads on November 3rd. It's a cheaper option for price-sensitive viewers and will cost just $7 a month, less than half the company's most popular current plan, which doesn't have commercials. Those stories and more available right now at thenationaldesk.com. And looking ahead to stories making headlines this coming week, Monday is the last day to file taxes for the 19 million Americans who requested extensions this year. You can file electronically or mail in your return as long as it's postmarked by October 17th. Important date. Also Monday, public schools will reopen in Lee County, Florida, nearly 3 weeks after Hurricane Ian hit the area. Some schools have irreparable damage, so those students will attend a host school until further notice. And Tuesday, the NBA regular season tips off. The Boston Celtics will host the Philadelphia 76ers at 7:30 p.m. The Golden State Warriors take on the Los Angeles Lakers at 10 p.m. Eastern. And still to come, busloads of migrants still being bused from southern border states to New York City. Still ahead, the temporary solutions in place to house the large number of migrants, plus a former border official on the impacts of the migrant surge on cities far from the border and the possible fate of the DACA program. You're watching The National Desk, America's News Now. Watch us live weekdays from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. and 10 p.m. till midnight Eastern Time. And of course, you can watch anytime online at thenationaldesk.com. We'll be right back.
The National Desk, America's News Now. The National Desk, America's News Now.
Less than a month out from the critical midterm elections, debates and campaign ads hoping to convince voters. But are they working, and what will matter most on Election Day? Then, migrant flight lawsuit. The information a watchdog group claims top Florida officials failed to hand over. And a migrant surge has a border town mayor calling out politicians on both sides of the aisle. This is the National Desk, America's News Now. I'm Eugene Ramirez. We are in the final stretch before the 2022 midterm election. Voters head to the polls in less than 4 weeks, with the control of Congress right now hinging on some key races and a scandal rocking a big race. Senate hopeful Herschel Walker says he knows the identity of the ex-girlfriend who says he paid for her abortion back in 2009. The Georgia Republican once again denying the bombshell allegation, calling it a flat-out lie.
So I didn't know who it was until last week. And I went, oh, and I said, that's not true. But they still ran with it. And so I said, you know, that's not true. I would say that's a lie. I call it a lie.
Now, despite the allegations, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said the GOP will stick with Walker. Candidates right now working to persuade voters on what they should care about most regarding both policies and personalities. So what are the biggest dividing issues? And what do the latest predictions tell us about who will have control of Congress? The National Desk chief political correspondent Scott Thuman has the latest numbers.
This is the Ohio Senate debate.
It's debate season, and for those who like a dose of drama in their politics, there is no shortage, like in the highly contentious Ohio Senate race.
When you have guys like J.D. Vance who can't stand up to anybody, Donald Trump said to J.D. Vance, all you do is kiss my ass to get my support.
Tim Ryan, who runs all these TV commercials saying that he wants to appeal to Trump voters, wants to appeal to Republicans, also says that he wants to kill and confront, what is it, the MAGA movement, Tim?
And separating the sides, divisive wedge issues. According to one breakdown by Axios, Democrats are spending millions of dollars on ads to galvanize voters upset about eroding abortion rights. Though Senator Bernie Sanders warns campaigning mostly on abortion would be a mistake, and Democrats have to fight Republican narratives that the left is dangerous for the economy. While President Biden suggests any gains will be lost if Democrats lose at the polls.
If Republicans take control of the Congress, these historic victories we just won for the American people are going to be taken away.
Republicans, meanwhile, highlighting a nationwide surge in crime, taking to the airwaves to paint Democrats as soft.
The bad guys belong in jail, and Mandela Barnes belongs nowhere near the Senate.
A risk Republicans allege to all Americans' safety. As it stands right now, Democrats have the power on Capitol Hill. In the House, it is narrow, and many analysts, like those over at Real Clear Politics, show Republicans will change that these midterms. The Senate's a much different story. There are at least 10 races, as you see here, all across the country that are considered battlegrounds. Currently, the Senate is split right down the middle, 50-50. And while there is polling showing the GOP in position to take that chamber too, others show Democrats holding on. All of it setting the stage for a real nail-biter just 1 month from now. On Capitol Hill, Scott Thuman for the National Desk.
New York City scrambling to find housing for the influx of migrants being bused there from the southern border. Well, asylum seekers will now have a new temporary home on Randall's Island, that's just south of the Bronx. The Humanitarian Emergency Response and Relief Center, as it's called, is expected to open in the coming weeks. However, listen to this, it'll only have room for 500 people. Right now, more than 16,000 migrants have arrived there in just the last few months.
They should stop sending buses to New York. New York cannot accommodate the number of buses that we have coming here to our city.
Now, many of the migrants are being bused from the border by Republican governors and El Paso's Democratic mayor. They're trying to get the Biden administration's attention by overwhelming primarily Democratic cities. In Florida, a nonprofit government watchdog group is now suing Governor Ron DeSantis and his staff, alleging they violated the state's public records law in relation to last month's migrant flights. Now, this lawsuit comes days after the governor's office released a handful of records related to those flights, which brought nearly 50 migrants from San Antonio, Texas, to Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. But watchdog groups says it's requested documents that officials have failed to produce. Now, this is the third lawsuit on the matter against DeSantis, who's also right now under investigation by a sheriff in Texas. The mayor of a Texas border town calling out politicians on both sides of the aisle over immigration. The mayor of Rio Grande City says he believes neither party has delivered on immigration reform in decades.
We have a tendency to look beyond our borders for the elusive root causes, when in reality, and unfortunately, the fact remains that politicians on both sides of the aisle are the root cause. No mayor or governor in America should bear the burden for our broken immigration system, regardless of which political party they're affiliated with.
Now, he says border security is critical and that immigration must also benefit the United States for it to remain viable. Our Jan Jeffcoat spoke with former Commissioner for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Mark Morgan, this week, asking if he thinks there's any city in the U.S. with the resources to accommodate the migrant surge.
Look, there is no city that can handle this, especially some of the small border communities. There are some counties that have less than 20,000 people. It's why you had a judge in Kenny County that declared their county was being invaded because every aspect of their public health, safety and security and finances was being overwhelmed. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see a shift in the sanctuary city policies. I think they're too wedded to these policies through ideology-driven thoughts as well as they see a perceived political benefit. But what we are seeing is a shift in their virtue signaling rhetoric. I mean, look, it was just a couple of weeks ago, Martha's Vineyard, a place that was very pro-illegal immigration, pro-open borders. They couldn't round up the illegal aliens fast enough and ship them out of one of the wealthiest enclaves probably in the face of the planet. And now, as you said, we have New York Mayor Adams, who quote said that what is happening now is going to impact every New Yorker in New York, and that the New Yorkers deserve to know why this is happening. Just replace New York with America and New Yorkers with Americans, and the mayor and I finally agree on something. It's exposed their hypocrisy, it's exposed their rhetoric, and we're seeing a shift in the dialogue right now.
Yeah, Mark, I was looking at some statistics from some of these border towns who are essentially having humanitarian crises right now. These tent cities have popped up. There's nowhere for these migrants to go. These small towns, as you mentioned, they don't have the resources. They're not getting help, they say, from the federal government. El Paso, Texas, for example, for the month of September, chartered 196 buses with 9,322 migrants to New York City and Chicago, and that was just a fraction of what they've had to deal with for months. But I think it's important also to understand what the process is here when they do cross the border, when migrants cross the border. How are they processed? Where do they go? How long are they in Border Patrol custody?
Yeah, Jay, look, this is a very important question, which again shows the hypocrisy and that this administration is lying to the American people. They made a big deal about a few thousand illegal aliens sent to the interior by Governor Abbott and DeSantis. What they're not telling you about is the last 19, 20 months, this administration has caught and released over 2 million illegal aliens, and they've shipped them to every state in this country, including New York City and Chicago and D.C. for the past 20 months. But they won't tell you anything about that. Here's how it works. For example, if you're an unaccompanied minor, you're usually kept just for a few hours. You're given to HHS, and then HHS takes these unaccompanied minors and flies them anywhere in the United States they can find a sponsor, including New York City. That has happened to the tune of 300,000 unaccompanied minors in the last 19 months. If you're a family or single adult, the Border Patrol, they're keeping you under 24 hours. They're releasing you to local communities who then NGOs take the mantle from there, and they're subsidized by DHS, which is subsidized by U.S. taxpayers. And where do they go? They go anywhere the illegal alien wants to go in the United States at taxpayers' expense, and that includes New York City. It's happening every day, all day long for the past 19 months, but yet this administration won't be honest to the American people about that.
The Fifth Circuit Court recently ruled that DACA was unlawful, but those who are still here will not be deported. President Biden lashed out at the ruling, blaming, quote, MAGA Republican judges. What do you see happening here with DACA?
This is just another joke. Look, the only issue here was a 2012 DACA memo that was signed by a political pen by then President Obama. It was unconstitutional the day he signed it. It was unlawful the day he signed it. A lower court recently said it was, and now this appeals court just confirmed the lower court. They said the 2012 memo was, in fact, unconstitutional and unlawful. And in the meantime, though, the DHS created a 500-page new rule. I call it DACA 2.0. That the appeals court sent it back to the lower court and said, hey, you got to decide on this too. I think they're going to find the same thing for the same reason. It's unlawful. So DACA is done, in my opinion. Now it's going to go back to another lawsuit that's going to happen. What do you do with the 700, 800,000 that are already enrolled in the program that this court didn't rule on? That's yet to be determined.
Mark, we've been hearing reports of border agents who are overworked and exhausted. You led one of the largest law enforcement divisions under previous administrations. You've been on the front lines with these agents. How would you describe working conditions for Border Patrol right now?
It's the worst it's ever been, Jay. They're demoralized. Look, because here's why. They know that this is not what's happened, the crisis that happened on the southwest border. They know that this isn't about root causes. They sure as heck know this isn't about climate change. I mean, what a joke. And they know that they can no longer do their job to protect this country. It's not just about illegal aliens coming in. They know that with the increase of illegal aliens, they're pulled off their front line and the border's wide open and drugs are pouring in, criminals are pouring in, national security vulnerabilities are pouring in, making their way to every town, city, and state in this country. And they know that they can no longer do their job to secure the borders and protect American people because of this administration's policies. They know it. And it's why I had a 26-year veteran that said for the first time in his life, he was getting dressed in the morning, he looked in the mirror, he's getting his uniform squared away, and he said, I just realized that I am now part of an agency that is the world's largest smuggling operation that we've ever seen. I think that tells it all.
The Biden administration announced a new immigration policy to manage the flow of migrants from Venezuela. The program would allow migrants from the country to apply to arrive at U.S. ports of entry, like airports, instead of attempting to cross the southern border. Now, it requires migrants to have a sponsor here in the U.S. and also undergo a screening process. President Biden is pardoning all prior federal convictions for simple marijuana possession, and he's asking governors to do the same on a state level. So we wanted to know just how much revenue could be generated if more states were to start regulating cannabis. I'm back with our fact-check team getting us the answers. Janae, give us the numbers.
So, Eugene, as of March, we found that states reported a total of $11.2 billion in tax revenue from legal adult-use cannabis sales, and that's according to the Marijuana Policy Project.
And where exactly is this happening?
Right, so 19 states have laws that legalize, tax, and regulate cannabis for adults 21 and older, including Colorado, Washington, California, Oregon, Alaska, Nevada, Massachusetts, and Michigan, just to name a few. And Rhode Island was just added to that list earlier this year. Now, sales will start in December, and we found reports that project just in the first 7 months of legalization, the state would get nearly $2.9 million in sales tax revenue.
Okay, but according to the CDC, researchers disagree on whether marijuana is a gateway drug. Regardless, that's the argument that some make in opposing legalization of cannabis. So what did you find on that, Connor?
There's still, like you said, a lot of debate around this topic, but a 2020 report from the National Institute on Drug Abuse says some research suggests marijuana use is likely to precede use and addiction to other drugs. And that study showed adults who used marijuana were more likely than adults who didn't use it to develop an alcohol use disorder.
Now, how big or broad is this concern?
That same agency says the majority of people who use marijuana don't go on to use other harder substances, but really more research is needed to determine if it can be called a gateway drug.
Okay, ladies, thank you both. And the fact-check team will continue to follow developments on these and other issues. You can also read this story with links to where they found their information on our website, thenationaldesk.com. And just ahead, caught on camera stealing baby clothes. A brazen porch pirate leaving a neighborhood surprised, then making the streets safer. Students take a stand asking drivers to join in on their campaign. You're watching The National Desk, America's News Now. The National Desk team of reporters bringing you the headlines from coast to coast. We're taking the pulse of America, and we start in Nevada, where a woman says her baby registry gifts were stolen right from her front porch.
You're looking at surveillance video of a thief stealing packages from a home in the Green Valley neighborhood in Henderson. He swiped several boxes from the front porch before running away. News 3 was able to speak with the homeowner, Sasha Estrada, but she asked that we not show her face out of fear for her safety. She's a single woman who's 6 months pregnant. She tells us those were gifts sent by family and friends from her baby registry. They had only been there for an hour.
When I saw it, it was almost a fear of, is this ever going to happen again? And, what would have happened if I was at home? Not that I wouldn't have been able to come out and stop him anyway, because who knows, he may have had a gun. And, all these kind of things run through your mind about like how much more dangerous it could have been.
Estrada says this has never happened before. Neighbors were also shocked to hear what happened, especially knowing the makeup of the community.
Yeah, because we've never had anything taken.
This guy is so brazen to be able to do it during the daytime where potentially people are walking their dogs, they're coming home, or I could have been having dinner. It just poses a danger and a threat, to my safety and the safety of those around in the community as well.
In Ohio, 9th graders are asking Cincinnati drivers to hit the brakes and slow down for their safety. Students stood at the 5 busiest intersections in the Westwood neighborhood with signs asking drivers to respect the speed limit there and, of course, to watch for students walking to class. That's all part of the Honk and Wave campaign. It aims to make streets safer for pedestrians.
To me, I feel like it's very important because as a student who goes to this school, there's a lot of walking that we have to do, and we are always outside because we're really big in agriculture and stuff. So I just feel like when people speed, it's not safe, and yeah, we could get hurt.
The campaign hopes to eventually partner with Westwood businesses and civic associations to help spread the message. And in Rhode Island, a New Bedford church will welcome its first transgender reverend presiding over services this Sunday. Reverend Donnie Anderson has been working with the congregation at the Pilgrim United Church of Christ for over a year now. She says she was worried about the barriers she would face when she came out 5 years ago, but has been welcomed with open arms there.
You know, it's one thing to say, as a church, we'll invite a transgender person to sit in our pews. It's another thing to say we'll invite a transgender person to be in our pulpit.
Anderson previously served as the executive minister of the Rhode Island State Council of Churches. And still to come, our team of correspondents breaking down this week in Washington, from the inflation fight to the battle at the ballot box. You're watching the National Desk, America's News Now.
Our Washington Bureau covers Capitol Hill and D.C. every day to report on the important issues facing the country and how they impact you. For some perspective on what's happening in the nation's capital and on the campaign trail, I'm joined by Chief Political Correspondent Scott Thuman. Scott, just over 3 weeks until Election Day and early voting already underway in a dozen or so states. In the race for control of Congress, candidates making their closing arguments to voters. Democrats seem to be focused on two key issues, abortion and a certain former president.
Yeah, well, it's certainly getting a lot of attention, especially from Democrats, as you point out, as they try to make this final push in the last 3+ weeks. You talk about abortion and how that early on in this election cycle was such a headline. And many people on the left believe that that would galvanize a lot of voters, get them to the polls if they weren't already interested enough, based solely on that issue, on what they believe was rights that were being eroded by a Supreme Court decision, a Supreme Court, much of which has been put into place by Republican presidents. So is that translating? Well, there's new polling out by Reuters Ipsos that shows that really only 5% of voters, so a small number, list abortion as their top priority right now. And that, in comparison to some other categories, is relatively small. We'll talk about more of that later. But they thought that was going to be what gets everyone out. Now, it may still be the case, but clearly among voters in general, that is not the driving force. Now, the other item you mentioned there is in reference to former President Trump. And of course, just this past week, you've had a subpoena issued by the committee investigating the January 6th attack for former President Trump to testify. This is another issue where Democrats believe if they continue to highlight the role that the former president may have played those attacks, what kind of destruction or damage or threat this may provide against democracy, they think that can help them at the polls for the midterms, making sure that Democrats remain in power in both the House and Senate. That is much more of a to-be-seen issue. We're going to have to dissect those results after midterms to find out how much the former president played a role.
Yeah, and two other issues that polling shows are of larger concern to voters, the economy and crime. That's what Republicans are focusing on.
Oh, absolutely. And you go back to that James Carville line of it's the economy, stupid. That is still going to be a focus for a lot of people. And in fact, that same polling I just referenced earlier, 31% of voters said the economy is their top priority. No other category came in double digits. The next one down was crime with 9%. So Republicans believe if they continue with this drumbeat on these two top issues, that's what's going to matter most to voters. And they're highlighting that as much as they humanly can, constantly saying that this fragile economy, this sluggish economy is because of President Biden and Democratic policies. And of course, also blaming that same party for crime in major cities, saying they've been too soft on crime. And as a result, people don't feel safe enough. If Republicans can hit those issues hard enough, they believe that's going to make the difference. And Steve, one point you and I were discussing this week, look at the fact that President Biden this week in California and then another stop in Oregon. Now, these are places that are heavily Democratic. And you talk about Oregon specifically, a lot of races there that should be gimmies, should be, a walk-in for a Democratic candidate. The president out there talking about lowering the costs on American families because he knows they need a little bit of help to get them across the finish line right now. It is a delicate situation, even in some places right now where Democrats typically would consider strongholds. So it's going to be a very interesting election night, to say the least.
Yeah, a lot to watch in the final stretch here. Chief Political Correspondent Scott Thuman, thank you. Eugene, back to you.
And thanks to our Capitol Hill team. A Trump employee told the FBI that the former president requested they move boxes of documents at Mar-a-Lago after receiving a subpoena for the classified material. The Washington Post reports the FBI also has security camera video of the staffer moving the boxes. Now, this development could be key to the federal criminal investigation that's looking into a range of potential crimes, including obstruction. Now, in response, a Trump spokesperson said in part, quote, the Biden administration has weaponized law enforcement. In an unrelated defamation lawsuit, a judge ruled former President Trump must answer questions under oath this coming week. The lawsuit was filed by an author who says Donald Trump raped her in the 90s. E. Jean Carroll claims the former president damaged her reputation in 2019 when he denied raping her. Trump's lawyers previously requested the testimony be delayed as appeals over the case play out. Still ahead, lasting mental health impacts of COVID lockdowns. We're diving into a new draft recommendation that could reshape your annual medical checkup. The COVID-19 pandemic put mental health in the spotlight as anxiety cases surged. As the National Desk's Angelo Brown reports, for the very first time, mental health professionals are now calling for routine anxiety screenings.
As the pandemic set in, anxiety deepened for millions of Americans, including this mom. How has the pandemic impacted you emotionally?
For me as a mother, a lot. I mean, especially the schools were closed, we were by ourselves.
The World Health Organization is reporting that the pandemic triggered a 25% increase in anxiety and depression worldwide. That happened to Swanee. Did you feel any extra anxiety?
Yes, definitely, because I couldn't work. I also was a working mother, and I had to stop for work for a few months.
For the first time, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force is recommending screening adults younger than 65 for anxiety.
That anxiety disorders are a mental health condition where there is excessive fear and worry that interferes with our daily life.
The screening would happen at your doctor's office, much like depression screenings happening right now during yearly checkups. The doctor would ask simply a series of questions. The task force says anxiety disorders often go undiagnosed for years. The median time for initiating treatment for anxiety is 23 years.
So people can be struggling with an anxiety disorder, not be identified, and then eventually get identified and treated. What we want to do is shorten that so that individuals can be identified earlier.
But even with yearly screenings, there are hurdles. Over 1/3 of Americans live in areas lacking mental health professionals. Those asking for help, like Swanee, may not get it right away. Did you reach out to someone to talk to?
I did. I did, but I didn't get any service to call me back. It took for like 3 months for somebody to call back, actually.
Right now, this is a draft recommendation. The task force is taking public comments until October 17th. The task force will then review those comments before making a final decision. In Washington, D.C., I'm Angela Brown.
And that's all for this weekend edition of the National Desk, America's News Now. Don't forget you can watch live weekdays from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. and 10 p.m. till midnight Eastern Time. Check your local listings for that. You can also watch us online and catch up with the latest headlines on thenationaldesk.com. Thanks for watching. I'm Eugene Ramirez. Have a great rest of your weekend.